Is architecture sexist? This is something that I've never thought about, never crossed my mind. But a feminist author has published a book. It's called Feminist City, and an excerpt from her book has been published on The Guardian, and it caught my attention. And I wanted to have an open dialogue discussion about it because I'm sure some people are going to disagree with me. Some people might not like what I have to say, but I think that this type of framing can be very destructive to the left, because it accuses things of being inherently sexist when I think in reality that was not the intention, not even close. So Leslie Kern is the author, and there were some good points mentioned in this excerpt, but I do also want to be clear that the good points mentioned by her have nothing to do with architecture. First of all, the piece is titled "Upward Thrusting Buildings Ejaculating into the Sky. Do cities have to be so sexist?" That's the headline. Subheadline reads, "Toxic masculinity is built into the fabric of our urban spaces," writes Leslie Kern, author of the new book, Feminist City. "And the results are just divisive. Aren't just divisive, they can be lethal." Okay, so I'm just gonna read you some of this and we'll discuss. As the feminist geographer, Jane Darke has said, "Our cities are patriarchy written in stone, brick, glass, and concrete. In other words, cities reflect the norms of the societies that build them, and sexism is a deep-rooted norm." All right, caught my attention, make the case. So she continues to write, "As far back as 1977, an American poet and professor of architecture named Dolores Hayden wrote an article with the explosive headline, 'Skyscraper Seduction, Skyscraper Rape.' Hayden tore into the male power fantasies embodied in this celebrated urban form. The lower tower," she wrote, the office tower, she wrote, "is one more addition to the procession of phallic monuments in history, including poles, obelisks, spires, columns, and watchtowers, where architects unironically use the language of base, shaft, and tip while drawing upward thrusting buildings, ejaculating light into the night sky." So she lost me there. And again, there were good points mentioned, even in this excerpt, right? But they have nothing to do with architecture. There is utility in the way these buildings are designed. And to be quite honest with you, I never looked at a skyscraper and thought about, like, I've never looked at a skyscraper and thought, oh, that's a massive penis that I'm about to walk into to take a meeting. But now I'm gonna think about that. And I just don't think that these buildings were designed by all these architects with sex in mind. And when I say sex, I mean biological sex. I'm not talking about intercourse, right? Now, I was actually really happy that I read this because I learned about feminine aesthetics in architecture, which I think is fascinating, right? But so far, I'm not buying this like argument that architecture, as it's been for so long, is like inherently sexist or meant to be sexist.
Yeah, so let me acknowledge that, like you said in the beginning, there were some interesting points made there. And so when the author talked about how men might not understand how unsafe women feel walking in certain parameters and contexts within the cities, and how intimidating they can be. I thought that was such a great point, and one that we challenge folks to think about other people's perspective all the time. And we need to challenge men to think about women's perspectives and maybe build infrastructure within the cities with that in mind, as an example. Okay, so those are the good points. When you get to this whole idea of their buildings thrusting upward, oh, for Christ's sake, right? I mean, it becomes a self-parody. What are they supposed to do? First of all, they're not thrusting anywhere. They're standing right there. They're building. They literally can't move, right? And if you have a light coming out of the building, it doesn't mean it's ejaculating the light. Okay, you made that up. That's not a thing, right? And if we built the buildings in the shape of women's body parts, I can guarantee you that they would also object to that and say it was part of the patriarchy. Imagine if we built buildings like women's breasts. They're going, oh, look at these men obsessed with women's body.
No, but Jake, but like, here's what my problem is. This is what my problem is. Who cares what the buildings look like, right? Like, of course I care in that I like aesthetically pleasing structures, but like as a woman, I'm not gonna see a building that resembles a vagina and feel empowered by that. I'm not gonna feel like, oh my God, all of the inequalities or all of the stereotypes that women have dealt with have now magically gone away because I've seen a vulva-shaped building across the street. I don't care. This is why I get frustrated with the left. And by the way, to be fair to her, I haven't read her whole book. I only read an excerpt of her book. And oftentimes the excerpts that get published are meant to be provocative in order to draw attention to the book. So I'm sure that there are valid, important points brought up in the book. But with that said, this nonsense about surface level, superficial actions, the performative nonsense, whether it be in response to accusations of racism or sexism or homophobia, transphobia, whatever it is, the surface level stuff means nothing. They do nothing to materially improve the lives of various disenfranchised groups, right? So what I wanted to know while reading this was, okay, but how do these buildings, these masculine buildings, negatively impact the lives of women, right? Like, what is the tangible takeaway here? And so there were some valid points brought up, but I don't think it has to do with skyscrapers. I think it has to do with how we've been defunding the social safety net, or cultural issues that we have in this country, or financial or economic inequality. And by the way, this author, I don't know where she's from, but this was written in the context of the UK. But we have similar issues, right? And so let me give you some examples that she raised that I thought were interesting. So she says, ask any woman who's tried to bring a baby carriage, that's what she meant, a baby carriage onto a bus, breastfeed in a park, or go for a jog at night. She intuitively understands the message the city sends her. This place is not for you. First of all, in America, you honestly can't breastfeed in a park without being harassed about it and shamed for it. So that's a huge problem in the United States. But let's say we're talking about a new mom who needs to breastfeed or pump while she's at work. Yeah, the company needs to make sure that there is a comfortable room for that woman to go and do that. That has nothing to do with phallic-like structures or the way these structures look. It has everything to do with the culture of companies and whether they're considerate enough to provide a safe environment for a woman to do what she needs to do to feed her child, period. That has nothing to do with the aesthetics of a building. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, of course. Look, it's nonsense. We're over talking about something that makes no sense at all. So I'm glad that we gave her credit for the things that are legitimate about city designs, but not about the buildings. So is the Ferris wheel in London is a giant part of the landscape? Is that an ode to matriarchy? I don't know. How do we design buildings in the shape of ovums? I don't know. And buildings
they exist.
Yeah.
So finish your point, and then I'll tell you what the feminine design is.
Okay. The reason why the buildings go up is to preserve space, because if you build them wide, it takes up more land. That's the number one reason. It's not because the guy wanted to be like, oh yeah, you want to see what I got? Oh yeah, I'm gonna build it really high. No, it was to fit within the city. And so, okay, here, I'll give you an example. When human beings, men and women, are standing up, well, are you being phallic by standing up? You look like a phallic symbol. When we're lying down, are we more feminine? It's absurd when we stand up. Yes, we look more phallic. It's not because we're part of the patriarchy. Oh, I look at your head. It looks like a, what does it look like? And your body, maybe it looks like a shaft. Maybe it does, but that's not the intent, okay? And you've got to be able to make the distinction. Otherwise, look, you hurt the left by having people think that everyone on the left believes these absurd things that are untrue. And then, by the way, some will say, Jake, Anna's allowed to say those things. You are not allowed to say those things because you're a woman, you're not a woman and you don't understand. Yeah, I don't agree with that either.
I think we should actually expand that to more topics. So I do agree with that, but go ahead, continue.
Well, thank you for allowing me to have this opinion since you're the executive producer of the show. Seriously, guys, we got to let everybody talk, and they're part of that spectrum too, and they make some interesting points. But overall, this does not help progressives when people make outlandish suggestions like this.
So I was unaware of this particular type of architecture until Brett Ehrlich told me about it. It's known as ionic architecture, and if you look at examples of it, it does definitely look like female genitalia in some cases. So for instance, stadiums oftentimes are designed in a way where it resembles what some might argue is a vagina. In fact, that particular stadium is the planned stadium in Qatar for the World Cup in, I believe, 2022. And people kept calling it the Vagina Stadium because it looks like one. But stadiums, by their very nature, are supposed to be a little more like wide, and they take up more space for obvious reasons. So to your point, Cenk, I think that the skyscrapers are built because of the specific utility in mind, right? The specific use in mind when the architects are building it. I just think that we have like way bigger fish to fry, and the legitimate issues that were brought up, at least in this excerpt, should be addressed. But I just don't think that it has to do with the patriarchy and its influence on building design.
In Qatar, they're not building vagina stadiums because they are really sensitive to abuses of patriarchy. No, they built it wide because a soccer field is wide. You cannot play soccer in a skyscraper, and you cannot build a giant wide building in the middle of New York because it's too expensive. So, all right, but if you want to make absurd points and think that you're morally superior for making those points, have at it, Hoss. But the rest of us don't think it makes any sense at all. When you sign up for a spend and save account at aspiration.com/TYT, we will plant 10 trees. Let's save the planet together.